After my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law bragged about inheriting the company, then said, "You were always disposable. We'll throw all your things away and turn your office into my relaxation lounge." At the notary's office, she read one line and stopped breathing. I never thought grief could feel like drowning until I stood in my own living room, watching strangers devour the ham sandwiches I'd made with shaking hands, just hours after burying Harold. 42 years of marriage, and here I was, a stranger in my own home, listening to my son's wife hold court like she owned the place. "Ruth, darling, where did you put the good china?" Stephanie's voice cut through the murmur of condolences like glass on concrete. She didn't wait for my answer, already directing her sister toward the dining room cabinet.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
We'll need to catalog everything valuable for the estate planning. Estate planning. Harold had been in the ground for exactly 4 hours. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall, clutching my coffee cup so tightly my knuckles went white. Through the doorway, I could see Paul accepting handshakes and murmured sympathy with the grace Harold had always admired in our son. But his eyes kept darting to Stephanie, seeking her approval for every response, every gesture. When had my boy started looking to his wife for permission to grieve his own father? "Mrs. Henderson, so lovely to see you again." Stephanie's voice carried that particular tone she used when she wanted something. I knew because I'd heard it directed at me countless times over the past 5 years. I was just telling Ruth how overwhelming all this must be for her at her age. The house is really too much for one person to manage. Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor for 15 years, glanced toward the kitchen where I stood invisible. "Oh, but Ruth has always managed beautifully. Harold used to brag about her gardens every spring." Stephanie's laugh tinkled like broken glass. "Well, that was when Harold was here to help her. Now she's all alone. And frankly, we're worried about her living in such a large house. Accidents happen, you know. Falls, forgotten stove burners." Heat flooded my cheeks. I was 64, not 94, and my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. But Stephanie had been painting this picture for months now. Little comments about my age, my supposed frailty, my inability to cope with modern life. "The company will need decisive leadership now," I heard her continue to Mrs. Henderson. "Harold built something wonderful, but it needs fresh vision. Paul and I have so many ideas for expansion. The company, Henderson and Associates, the architecture firm Harold had built from nothing, working 16-hour days in our garage while I kept the books and answered phones. I'd been there for every late night, every difficult client, every celebration when we finally moved into our first real office. But somehow, in Stephanie's version of history, I'd never existed at all. I moved closer to the doorway, unable to stop myself from listening. "Ruth was Harold's secretary for years, weren't you, Ruth?" Stephanie's voice found me even though I hadn't made a sound. "She knows where all the files are, so she'll be helpful during the transition. But running a modern business requires energy, technological skills, fresh perspectives." Secretary. 22 years of partnership, of building something beautiful together, reduced to filing and coffee duties. "Actually," Mrs. Henderson said carefully, "I remember when Ruth designed the Morrison house. Harold was so proud of her work, said she had a natural eye for—" "Oh, that was just sketching," Stephanie interrupted smoothly. "Ruth's always been artistic, which is lovely, but architecture is a serious profession now. Liability issues, computer-aided design, sustainability requirements. It's not really something someone her age could adapt to." The Morrison house. My first and only official project, where Harold had finally convinced me to put my name on the plans alongside his. I'd spent months perfecting every detail, working late into the night to create something that would make Harold proud. The clients had loved it, wanted to hire me for their next project. But then Stephanie had entered our lives, and somehow my confidence had withered under her constant subtle corrections, her helpful suggestions about staying in my lane. "Mom, there you are." Paul appeared beside me, his arm sliding around my shoulders in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to observers. "Stephanie's been looking for you. We need to discuss some practical matters." He guided me toward the dining room where Stephanie stood with a clipboard, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the circumstances. She wore black, of course, but it was the kind of expensive black that whispered designer labels and country club memberships. "Ruth, sweetie, I know this is difficult, but we need to be practical." She clicked her pen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge. "The house is far too big for you now, and honestly, the upkeep must be overwhelming." I opened my mouth to protest, but she continued without pause. Paul and I have been researching assisted living communities. Nothing institutional, of course. Sunny Haven has lovely apartments, and they handle all the maintenance, the cooking. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. I don't need assisted living, I managed to whisper. This is my home. Stephanie's smile was patient, patronizing. Of course it's been your home, and you've done such a wonderful job maintaining Harold's vision. But let's be honest, you've been struggling since his illness began. The garden's completely overgrown. You've been forgetting appointments. And last week you left the stove on all night. That last part was a lie. I'd never left the stove on. But Paul was nodding along, his face creased with manufactured concern. We're worried about you, Mom, he said, and for a moment he sounded like my little boy again. Living alone at your age, in a house this size. What if something happened? What if you fell and we didn't find you for days? The worst part was that a tiny voice in my head wondered if they were right. Harold's illness had been exhausting, the funeral arrangements overwhelming. Maybe I was too old, too tired, too broken to maintain the life we'd built together. The company needs immediate attention, Stephanie continued, consulting her clipboard. Harold left things a bit disorganized, and we can't afford to lose clients while we sort through his files. I'll need access to all the business records, of course. Client lists, financial statements, ongoing projects. I know where everything is, I said quietly. I can help you understand Harold's system. But that's so sweet of you to offer. Stephanie's voice dripped with false gratitude. But really, we'll need to modernize everything. Digital files, cloud storage, updated client management systems. I'm sure you'd find it all very confusing. Paul squeezed my shoulder. What Stephanie's trying to say is that we want to honor Dad's legacy by bringing the company into the 21st century. You built something wonderful together, but now it's time for the next generation to take over. The next generation. As if I were some relic from a bygone era instead of a woman who'd worked side by side with Harold for over 2 decades. Where will I live? The question slipped out before I could stop it, small and pathetic in the suddenly quiet room. Well, that's what we need to discuss, Stephanie said, her voice taking on the tone she might use with a particularly slow child. The house will need to be sold, of course. It's much too valuable to sit empty, and frankly, you can't afford the taxes and maintenance on your widow's benefits. Sold. The house where Paul had taken his first steps, where we'd hosted Christmas mornings and birthday parties and anniversary dinners, where Harold and I had danced in the kitchen just last month, even though he was already too weak to support his own weight. But this is my home, I repeated, hating how my voice cracked. And it always will be in your memories, Stephanie said with practiced sympathy. But memories don't pay property taxes or fix leaking roofs. You'll be so much happier at Sunny Haven, without all these burdens weighing you down. I looked at Paul, searching his face for some sign of the son who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. Paul? This is the house you grew up in, where your father... Mom, we've discussed this. His voice was firm, final. We want what's best for you. Dad would want us to take care of you. No. Harold would want me to fight. Harold would want me to remember who I was before grief and exhaustion, and Stephanie's constant undermining had worn me down to nothing. But as I stood there in my dining room, surrounded by the debris of my husband's funeral, I felt something inside me break apart like old paper. These people discussing my future as if I weren't standing right there. They weren't strangers. They were my family, the only family I had left, and they were throwing me away like yesterday's newspaper. I need some air, I whispered, and stumbled toward the back door before anyone could stop me. Outside, the garden Harold and I had planted together bloomed in glorious defiance of everything falling apart inside. His roses climbed the trellis he'd built for our 20th anniversary. The herb garden I'd started still flourished where he'd expanded it last spring. I sank onto the wooden bench we'd bought for our 40th anniversary, the one where we'd sat every evening, planning our retirement, dreaming about traveling together, growing old in the house we'd made beautiful. Through the kitchen window, I could see Stephanie showing Paul something on her phone, both of them animated in a way they hadn't been during the actual funeral, planning my exile, no doubt, calculating the profits from selling my life out from under me. Harold's voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze. Remember what I told you, Ruthie. If something happens to me, remember what I said about taking care of yourself first. I closed my eyes, trying to recall the conversation. It had been during his final weeks, when the pain medication made him drift in and out of clarity. He'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and made me promise something, but I'd been so focused on his comfort, on making sure he wasn't afraid, that I hadn't really listened. What had he said about taking care of myself? Behind me, the back door opened and Stephanie's heels clicked across the patio. "Ruth," There you are. We really do need to finish this conversation. I've called Sunny Haven, and they have an opening next week. Isn't that wonderful? You won't have to wait. I turned to look at her, this woman who'd somehow convinced my son that his mother was a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Next week? Well, there's no point in prolonging the inevitable, is there? And honestly, the sooner we can start preparing the house for sale, the better. The market's quite good right now for properties like this. Properties like this. My home reduced to square footage and market value. Paul agrees it's for the best, she continued when I didn't respond. He's already spoken to Harold's lawyer about transferring everything into our names for easier management. Much simpler than dealing with complex estate procedures. Something cold settled in my chest. Harold's lawyer. Had they really moved that quickly? Or had this conversation happened before Harold was even in the ground? You seem to have everything planned out, I said quietly. Stephanie's smile was bright and sharp. Well, someone has to think practically about these things. You've been through so much, Ruth. Let us take care of the details so you can focus on healing. Healing. As if grief were a broken bone that would mend in 6 weeks if I just stayed quiet and out of the way. I should get back inside, I said, standing slowly. Help clean up. Oh, don't worry about that. I've got everything under control. Of course she did. Stephanie always had everything under control. As I walked back toward the house, I caught sight of my reflection in the sliding glass door. A small woman in a shapeless black dress, silver hair escaping from the neat bun I'd attempted that morning. I looked exactly like what Stephanie wanted everyone to see. A fragile widow, overwhelmed and ready to be put away somewhere convenient, but something in my eyes looked different, harder. Harold had always said I was stronger than I knew. Maybe it was time to find out if he was right. The moving boxes arrived 3 days after the funeral. I stood in my kitchen, still wearing Harold's old flannel robe because it smelled like him, watching 2 men in matching uniforms stack cardboard containers on my dining room table. Stephanie directed them with the efficiency of a general commanding troops, her clipboard never leaving her manicured hands. Those go to storage, she said, pointing to the boxes labeled Ruth's personal items. And those go to donation. The pile marked outdated household goods contained my grandmother's china, the mixing bowls I'd used to make Paul's birthday cakes for 25 years, and the cast iron skillet Harold had bought me for our first anniversary. Stephanie, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, this is happening very fast. She turned to me with that patient smile I'd grown to hate. Oh, Ruth, I know it seems overwhelming, but trust me, this is exactly what you need. A fresh start without all these reminders of the past weighing you down. Reminders of the past, as if my entire life was something to be discarded like outdated magazines. Mom's having trouble with transitions, Paul explained to the movers, speaking about me as if I weren't standing right there. We're trying to make this as easy as possible for her. Easy. Nothing about this felt easy. It felt like being erased. I walked slowly through the house, watching strangers handle my belongings with careless efficiency. In the living room, they'd already removed the family photos from the mantel, replacing them with what Stephanie called neutral staging elements. Generic candles and artificial flowers that made the space look like a hotel lobby. The realtor says we should be able to list by next week, Stephanie was telling someone on her phone as she supervised the packing of our book collection. The market's hot for properties in this neighborhood. We should clear at least 6 figures over asking price. 6 figures. I thought of all the nights Harold and I had sat at the kitchen table, carefully calculating mortgage payments, saving every penny to pay off the house early so we could leave Paul something substantial. We'd finally made the last payment 2 years ago, celebrating with champagne and dancing in the empty living room. Now that sacrifice was just another line item in Stephanie's profit calculation. In Harold's study, I found them dismantling his drafting table, the one he'd inherited from his mentor and used for every project over the past 30 years. Stephanie directed the movers to load it with the office furniture for donation pile. Wait, I said, stepping forward. That table has sentimental value. Harold designed our first house on it. Mom, it's just an old drafting table, Paul said without looking up from the file cabinet he was emptying. Nobody uses those anymore. Everything's computerized now. I could keep it. In my apartment at Sunny Haven. Stephanie laughed, a sound like ice cubes dropping into a glass. Ruth, sweetie, you'll have a lovely studio apartment. There's no room for large furniture pieces. Besides, you want to keep things simple at your age. At my age, every conversation seemed to circle back to my supposed decrepitude. I watched Harold's table disappear into the donation pile and felt a piece of my heart go with it. How many evenings had I sat beside him at that table, reviewing plans, offering suggestions, being his partner in every sense of the word. But none of that mattered now. I was just the widow who needed to get out of the way. "What about the business files?" I asked, noticing Paul loading boxes into his car. "Some of those client relationships go back decades. You'll need the history to understand." "Actually, Ruth, that's something we need to discuss." Stephanie set down her clipboard and fixed me with a look that made my stomach clench. "Paul and I have decided to rebrand the company. Henderson and Associates is going to become Morrison Design Group." Morrison, her maiden name. "But Harold built the Henderson reputation over 40 years. I said, shocked. "Clients trust that name. They know what it represents." "What it represents," Stephanie said carefully, "is outdated thinking. Traditional design, old-fashioned customer service. Paul and I want to modernize everything. Sleek branding, contemporary aesthetics, digital marketing. Henderson and Associates sounds like something from your parents' generation." "My parents' generation, not even mine anymore." Paul was nodding along like one of those bobblehead dolls people put in their cars. "Stephanie's done extensive market research, Mom. The Morrison name tests much better with our target demographic." Target demographic. When had architecture become about demographics instead of creating beautiful spaces where families could build their lives? "What about Harold's legacy?" I asked quietly. "Doesn't that mean anything?" "Of course it does," Stephanie said with fake warmth. "We're planning a lovely memorial plaque in the new office lobby, something tasteful about the company's founding. But we have to be realistic about moving forward." A plaque, 40 years of Harold's life reduced to a brass rectangle on a wall. That afternoon, while Stephanie supervised the removal of our bedroom furniture, I retreated to the basement where some of Harold's older files were stored. I needed to see the papers from when we'd first started the company, to remind myself that we'd been partners, not boss and secretary like Stephanie insisted on telling everyone. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Tucked behind a box of Christmas decorations, I discovered a manila folder labeled Personal SM in Harold's careful handwriting. Inside were photocopies of credit card statements, phone records, and what looked like receipts from expensive restaurants and hotels, all in Stephanie's name. All from the past 3 years. My hands shook as I flipped through the evidence. Lunches at the country club on company time, shopping trips charged to the business account, hotel stays in the city when she claimed to be visiting clients, and recurring payments to something called executive consulting services, $5,000 a month for the past 2 years. Harold had been investigating his own daughter-in-law. I sank onto an old chair, the papers scattered across my lap like pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to complete. Why would Harold have collected all this evidence? What had he suspected that I'd been too trusting to see? The basement door creaked open above me. "Ruth? Are you down there?" Stephanie's voice carried a note of impatience. "The movers need to know what to do with the basement items." I quickly gathered the papers and shoved them back into the folder, my heart pounding. "Just looking for some old photo albums," I called back. "Well, hurry up. We have a schedule to keep." I climbed the stairs slowly, the folder clutched against my chest beneath my sweater. Whatever Harold had discovered, whatever he'd been planning to do with this information, Stephanie couldn't know I'd found it. But the pieces were starting to form a picture that made me sick to my stomach. Back in the kitchen, I found Stephanie on the phone again, her voice bright with false enthusiasm. "Oh yes, the transition is going beautifully," she was saying. "Ruth is so excited about her new apartment. She keeps saying how relieved she is to not have to worry about home maintenance anymore." I'd never said any such thing. "The business is thriving under new management. We're already implementing efficiency improvements that should increase profitability by at least 30% this quarter." Efficiency improvements, like firing Mrs. Patterson, Harold's longtime secretary, because her salary was bloated for someone without a college degree. Like dropping the pro bono work Harold had always insisted on for young families and nonprofit organizations. Like raising prices on existing clients by 40% because they're getting premium service now. Everything Harold had built his reputation on was being systematically dismantled. "Mom, we need to talk about something else," Paul said, settling beside me at the kitchen table that would be gone by tomorrow. "Stephanie found some irregularities in Dad's financial records." My stomach dropped. "What kind of irregularities?" "Missing money," Stephanie said, ending her phone call and joining us. "Significant amounts. Cash withdrawals, transfers to accounts we can't identify. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars that should have been company assets." I stared at them both. "That's impossible. Harold kept meticulous records. Every penny was accounted for." "That's what we thought too," Stephanie said with manufactured sadness. "But the evidence suggests otherwise. Either Harold was hiding assets, or—" She paused dramatically. "Well, There might have been some kind of cognitive decline, memory issues, confusion about financial management. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. They were suggesting Harold had been incompetent or dishonest in his final years. Harold's mind was sharp until the end, I said firmly. His illness was physical, not mental. Ruth, sweetie, you were dealing with so much stress. Stephanie's voice dripped with false compassion. Sometimes we don't see the signs because we're too close to the situation. It's perfectly natural for elderly people to become confused about money management. Elderly people. Harold had been 68, hardly ancient. Where exactly is this money supposed to have gone? I asked. Paul shifted uncomfortably. We're still investigating. The accountant thinks it might have been some kind of tax shelter Dad set up without telling us. Or maybe he was planning a surprise for you and never had the chance to explain it. A surprise. The only surprise was how quickly my family had turned Harold into either a criminal or a man losing his mental faculties. In any case, Stephanie continued, it's another reason why the estate needs professional management. These kinds of financial irregularities can be very complicated to resolve. I looked at my son, searching his face for some sign of doubt. Some indication that he questioned his wife's convenient discoveries, but Paul was staring at the table, unwilling to meet my eyes. We'll figure it all out, he said quietly. The important thing is that you don't have to worry about any of this. We'll handle everything. Handle everything. Including, apparently, rewriting the story of who Harold had been and what he'd accomplished. That evening, after the movers had gone and Stephanie had left to research facility options for me, I sat alone in my mostly empty kitchen with the manila folder spread before me. Harold's evidence painted a clear picture of financial misconduct, but not by him. Stephanie had been stealing from the company for years. The executive consulting services payments were going to a company she'd set up herself. The restaurant and hotel charges were personal expenses billed to business accounts. She'd been systematically looting Harold's life's work while painting herself as the company's savior. And now she was accusing Harold of the very crimes she'd committed. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed Paul's number. Mom, I wanted to check on you. I know today was difficult. For a moment, I almost told him everything, almost explained what I'd found, what his wife had really been doing to his father's company. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the tired resignation in his voice, or the way he'd stood beside Stephanie all day without once questioning her decisions. Maybe it was the growing certainty that he'd choose to believe her version of events rather than accept the truth about the woman he'd married. I'm fine, I said instead. Just tired. Good. Well, get some rest. Tomorrow we'll finalize the Sunny Haven paperwork, and then you can start looking forward to your new life. My new life. As if being warehoused in an assisted living facility while my daughter-in-law profited from my husband's death was some kind of gift. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about Harold's words from those final weeks. Something about taking care of myself first, about remembering something important if anything happened to him. What had he been trying to tell me? And why did I have the growing certainty that Stephanie's rush to get me out of the house had less to do with my supposed fragility and more to do with hiding evidence of her crimes? I looked around at the boxes and empty spaces, at the systematic dismantling of everything Harold and I had built together. Tomorrow, I would be Ruth Henderson, assisted living resident. My old life would be boxed up and donated, sold off and forgotten. But tonight, I was still Ruth Henderson, Harold's partner, the woman who'd helped build something beautiful from nothing. And I was starting to remember that Harold had been a very careful man who never did anything without a plan. I barely slept that night, lying on the bare mattress in what used to be our bedroom, thinking about Harold's final words. The moving truck would return in the morning to take away the last of my belongings, and by evening I'd be signing papers at Sunny Haven, officially becoming someone else's problem to manage. But something nagged at me, a memory just out of reach. Harold gripping my hand during one of his lucid moments, his voice urgent despite the medication. Ruthie, promise me something. If anything happens to me, if they try to make you feel small, remember the blue box, the one I told you about keeping safe, the blue box. I'd forgotten about it completely in the chaos of his illness and death. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly racing. Harold had mentioned a blue box several times over the years, always in passing, always with that particular look he got when he was being deliberately casual about something important. I'd assumed it was just another one of his organizational systems, like the color-coded files in his office, or the alphabetized tool chest in the garage. But what if it wasn't? I slipped out of bed and made my way to the basement, using my phone's flashlight to navigate around the remaining boxes. If Harold had hidden something, it would be somewhere Stephanie hadn't thought to look. somewhere personal and private. Behind the old water heater, in a corner where the ceiling sloped too low for anyone to stand comfortably, I found it. A medium-sized metal box, painted blue decades ago, now faded and scratched from years of storage. It had been positioned deliberately, wedged between two support beams where it would be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. My hands shook as I lifted it out, surprised by its weight. A small combination lock held it closed, the kind Harold used on his toolboxes. I tried our anniversary date, 06/15/78. Nothing. Paul's birthday. Our address numbers. Then I remembered Harold's habit of using backwards dates for anything really important. 87/51/60. The lock clicked open. Inside, beneath a layer of protective plastic, were papers. Lots of them. But these weren't the business documents I'd expected. These were letters, all addressed to me in Harold's familiar handwriting. Each envelope dated and sealed. The top envelope bore yesterday's date, 3 days after Harold's death. With trembling fingers, I opened it. My dearest Ruthie, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and I'm no longer there to protect you from what's coming. By now, you've probably discovered that Stephanie isn't the woman we thought she was. You've probably been made to feel small, unnecessary, like a burden. I'm so sorry, my love. I should have acted sooner. I pressed the letter to my chest, Harold's voice so clear in my mind that I could almost feel him sitting beside me in the basement's shadows. I've been documenting Stephanie's activities for the past 3 years. The evidence is all here. Bank records, forged signatures, false billing. She's been stealing from the company systematically, and she's been planning to push you out of our life long before I got sick. I heard her on the phone with someone, talking about the old woman problem and how much easier everything would be once she had you safely tucked away somewhere. The words hit me like physical blows. Old woman problem, as if my very existence was an inconvenience to be solved. I know you, Ruthie. I know you're probably blaming yourself right now, wondering how you didn't see this coming. But that's because you're good, and you trust people to be good too. Stephanie counted on that. She counted on your kindness, your willingness to step back and let others take charge. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, but the tears kept coming. But here's what she doesn't know, what I never told anyone except my lawyer. The business was never in my name alone. Remember when we incorporated 22 years ago? You signed those papers thinking you were just witnessing my signature, but what you actually signed made you a 50% partner in Henderson and Associates. Equal ownership, equal decision-making power, equal rights to everything we built together. I dropped the letter, staring at it in disbelief. Equal partner? But that couldn't be right. I'd always just been the helper, the supportive wife who kept the books and answered phones. Harold made the important decisions, met with the big clients, signed the contracts. With shaking hands, I picked up the letter and continued reading. I never told you because I wanted you to feel free to step back when Paul was young, to focus on being the mother you wanted to be without worrying about business obligations. But legally, contractually, you've been my full partner this entire time. Every major contract, every property acquisition, every business decision over the past 2 decades required your consent, even if you didn't realize you were giving it. The basement seemed to spin around me. I thought of all the papers I'd signed over the years, all the documents Harold had brought home for my review. I'd trusted him completely, signed whatever he put in front of me because I knew he would never do anything to hurt our family. But apparently, he'd been protecting me in ways I never understood. Stephanie can't sell the house, Ruthie. It's in both our names, and with me gone, you're the sole owner. She can't change the business name or alter company operations without your written consent. She can't transfer assets or close accounts or fire longtime employees. Everything she's told you and Paul about taking over the company is based on assumptions that simply aren't true. I sat back on my heels, the implications washing over me. Stephanie's confidence, her rush to get me out of the house, her insistence on immediate changes to the business, it was all based on lies. She'd been operating under the assumption that Harold was the sole owner, that his death would automatically transfer everything to Paul as his only heir. She had no idea that I wasn't just Harold's widow. I was his business partner, his equal. In this box, you'll find copies of all the incorporation papers, the partnership agreements, the property deeds. You'll also find documentation of every theft Stephanie has committed, every forged signature, every fraudulent transaction. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago when I realized how extensive her crimes had become. It's all documented, all legally admissible. I rifled through the remaining papers, finding exactly what Harold had described. Bank statements showing the fake consulting payments, copies of credit card bills for personal expenses charged to the company, screenshots of emails where Stephanie discussed plans to restructure the business once the old generation was out of the picture. And beneath all of that, the incorporation papers from 1998. Clear as day, in black and white legal language, Ruth Henderson and Harold Henderson, equal partners in Henderson and Associates architecture firm. How had I forgotten? But even as I asked myself the question, I remembered. It was just after Paul had started college, and I'd been so overwhelmed with worry about tuition payments and his adjustment to university life. Harold had brought home a stack of papers during one of my particularly anxious weeks, explaining that it was just legal formalities to protect our assets. I'd signed everything without really reading it, trusting Harold to handle the business side of our lives while I focused on being the supportive wife and mother I thought I was supposed to be. But Harold had been thinking 20 years ahead even then. He'd been protecting me in ways I never could have imagined. By now, the letter continued, "You're probably wondering what to do with this information. Part of me hopes you'll take it straight to the police and have Stephanie arrested for theft and fraud. She deserves that, and worse. But I know you, my love. You'll want to protect Paul, even though he's failed to protect you." Harold knew me so well. Even reading his words from beyond the grave, I could feel my maternal instincts kicking in. Paul was still my son. Still the little boy I'd rocked to sleep and worried over through every childhood illness. The thought of him losing his wife to prison, his children growing up with a mother behind bars. "So, here's what I suggest," Harold's letter continued, as if he could hear my thoughts. "Give them a chance to make this right. Show them the evidence. Make them understand what Stephanie has really been doing. If they choose to do the right thing, if they acknowledge your partnership, treat you with the respect you deserve, and make restitution for what's been stolen, then maybe this family can heal." I thought about the contempt in Stephanie's voice when she called me disposable. The casual way she'd dismissed 40 years of my life as outdated thinking. The systematic erasure of my contributions to everything Harold and I had built together. "But if they don't," Harold's letter concluded, "if they continue to treat you like some burden to be managed, rather than the remarkable woman who helped build everything they're trying to steal, then use this information to protect yourself. You have more power than you know, Ruthie. You always have. I just hope you'll finally be willing to use it." I set the letter aside and picked up another envelope, this one dated 6 months ago. Inside, Harold had written detailed instructions about accessing hidden bank accounts, safety deposit boxes, investment portfolios I'd never known existed. "These are your emergency funds," he'd written. "Money I've been setting aside for years, just in case something like this ever happened. Enough to ensure you'll never be dependent on anyone else's charity. Never have to accept being treated as less than you are. Emergency funds." While I'd been worrying about making ends meet on Harold's life insurance, there were accounts in my name containing enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. The irony was devastating. Stephanie had been stealing thousands of dollars from the company while I sat on resources I didn't even know I had. She'd been positioning herself as my financial savior while I was actually wealthier than she could have imagined. I spent the next hour reading through every document in the box, understanding for the first time the true scope of what Harold and I had built together. The business was worth far more than I'd realized. The property investments, the retirement accounts, the careful financial planning Harold had done over decades of marriage. It added up to a substantial estate, an estate that belonged to me, not to Stephanie. As dawn light began filtering through the basement window, I carefully repacked everything except Harold's most recent letter. That one, I folded and tucked into my robe pocket, close to my heart. Upstairs, I could hear movement. Stephanie had said she'd be here early to help me pack the last of my belongings before the trip to Sunny Haven. No doubt she was already planning how to redecorate the master bedroom, how to transform Harold's study into her personal office space. I made coffee with the automatic machine that would be gone by noon, standing in my empty kitchen and thinking about the woman I'd been just 12 hours ago. That Ruth Henderson had felt powerless, disposable, grateful for whatever scraps of consideration her family might throw her way. But that woman had been operating from incomplete information. This Ruth Henderson, the real Ruth Henderson, Harold's equal partner, the co-owner of everything Stephanie was trying to steal. This woman had choices. I heard Stephanie's car in the driveway, heard her heels clicking across the front porch with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. But she didn't know about the blue box. She didn't know about the partnership papers, the evidence of her crimes, the resources I had at my disposal. She didn't know that her old woman problem was about to become her worst nightmare. The front door opened without a knock. Stephanie had made herself quite at home in what she thought was now her house. "Ruth, are you ready for your big day?" Her voice carried that familiar, patronizing cheerfulness. "I've brought the final papers for you to sign. Just a few more formalities and then we can get you settled in your new home." Formalities. Transfer papers, probably. Documents that would officially sign away my rights to everything Harold and I had spent our lives building. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. "I'll be right there, Stephanie." I called back. I just need to gather a few things first. I picked up the blue box and Harold's letter, feeling the weight of 42 years of love and partnership in my hands. Time to remind everyone exactly who Ruth Henderson really was. I found Stephanie in the living room, spreading papers across the coffee table with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy blazer, her professional woman uniform, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older, more authoritative. "There you are," she said without looking up. "I've organized everything by priority. Property transfer documents first, then the business succession papers, and finally the Sunny Haven admissions forms. Business succession papers. Even the language was designed to make Harold's death sound like a planned corporate transition rather than the devastating loss it actually was. I set the blue box on the mantel, noting how Stephanie's eyes flicked toward it briefly before returning to her documents. She probably assumed it contained sentimental trinkets I was insisting on keeping. Another sign of an elderly woman's inability to let go of the past. "Before we begin," I said, settling into Harold's favorite armchair, "I think we should call Paul. He should be here for this conversation." "Oh, that's not necessary. Paul's handling the office transition this morning. Besides, these are just formalities, nothing that requires his immediate attention. Formalities. The systematic theft of my life's work reduced to paperwork and signatures." "I insist," I said, pulling out my phone. "This affects him, too." Something flickered across Stephanie's face. Irritation, maybe, or calculation. But she nodded with false graciousness. "Of course, whatever makes you more comfortable." Paul arrived 20 minutes later, looking harried and slightly out of breath. "Sorry, Mom. The new office systems are giving me trouble, and 3 clients called about project delays." "Project delays?" I asked. "Nothing serious," Stephanie interjected quickly. "Just some scheduling conflicts while we transition to the new management structure." But Paul's expression suggested otherwise. He looked tired in a way that went beyond grief, stressed in a way I recognized from Harold's early days of building the business. Something was wrong. "Now then," Stephanie said, reclaiming control of the conversation. "Ruth, if you could just sign here and initial this page." She slid the first document toward me. Property deed transfer. I glanced at it briefly, noting the legal language that would officially remove my name from the house Harold and I had bought together 30 years ago. "Actually," I said, "before I sign anything, I have some questions about the business finances." Stephanie's pen paused midair. "Questions?" "Harold always handled the books, but I'd like to understand our current position. Cash flow, outstanding debts, that sort of thing." "Mom, you don't need to worry about," Paul started. "I'd like to worry about it," I interrupted gently. Humor an old woman's curiosity. I watched Stephanie's face carefully as she processed this request. Her smile remained perfectly in place, but something tightened around her eyes. "Well, as I mentioned yesterday, there are some irregularities we're still investigating. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." "What kind of irregularities?" Paul shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we've been through this. Dad apparently made some unusual financial decisions in his final months. We're working with the accountant to sort everything out." Unusual financial decisions. Harold, who had balanced his checkbook to the penny every month for 40 years, had suddenly become fiscally irresponsible in his final months of life. "Could you be more specific?" I asked. Stephanie exchanged a glance with Paul before answering. "Large cash withdrawals, transfers to offshore accounts, payments to consulting firms we can't identify. We're talking about nearly $200,000 in unexplained transactions." $200,000. Almost exactly the amount Harold's investigator had documented as Stephanie's thefts over the past 3 years. "That does sound concerning," I said carefully. "Have you reported this to the authorities?" "Oh no," Stephanie said quickly. "We wouldn't want to damage Harold's reputation over what might simply be confused record-keeping. You know how older people can become. Muddled about financial matters." Muddled. Another gentle way of suggesting Harold had been losing his mental faculties. "I'd like to see the documentation," I said. "Ruth, really, these are complex business matters." "I'd like to see the documentation," I repeated, letting some steel creep into my voice. After all, I was married to Harold for 42 years. I knew his habits, his thought processes. Maybe I can shed some light on what he was thinking. Paul looked relieved at this suggestion. "That's actually a good idea. Mom knew Dad better than anyone." But Stephanie's expression had hardened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure that's wise. These documents contain sensitive financial information. And frankly, Ruth, you might find them upsetting. I think I can handle it." A longer pause this time. I could almost see Stephanie calculating, trying to determine how much information she could safely share without exposing her own crimes. "Very well," she said finally. "Paul, Why don't you get the files from the car? While Paul was outside, Stephanie turned to me with a concerned expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ruth, I hope you understand that we're only trying to protect you from all this unpleasantness. Harold's final months were difficult for everyone. If there were financial indiscretions, it's probably better for his memory if we handle things quietly. Financial indiscretions. She was really committed to this narrative of Harold as an incompetent or dishonest old man. I appreciate your concern, I said. But I'd rather know the truth. Paul returned with a thick folder and spread the contents across the coffee table. Bank statements, canceled checks, wire transfer records, exactly the kind of evidence Harold had warned me Stephanie would use to cover her tracks. I studied the documents carefully, noting the forged signatures that looked almost but not quite like Harold's handwriting. The transfers to Morrison Consulting Services, a company that didn't exist beyond Stephanie's bank account. The credit card charges for personal expenses disguised as business meals and client entertainment. It was all there, just as Harold had predicted, but presented in a way that made him look like the criminal instead of the victim. This is very troubling, I said finally. I know, Paul said, sinking into his chair. I can't understand what Dad was thinking. It's so unlike him. It certainly is, I agreed. Harold was always so careful with money, so honest about business expenses. These records don't sound like him at all. Something in my tone made Stephanie look at me sharply. What do you mean? Well, for instance, this payment to Morrison Consulting Services. I held up one of the transfer records. Harold never worked with outside consultants. He always said the family business should stay in the family. Times change, Stephanie said carefully. Maybe he realized he needed outside expertise. Maybe. But it's curious that he never mentioned it to me. We discussed everything related to the business. I paused, letting that sink in. Everything. The room had grown very quiet. Paul was studying the documents with new attention, while Stephanie sat frozen with that false smile locked on her face. Also, I continued, this signature doesn't look quite right to me. I pulled out one of the forged checks and held it up to the light. Harold always made his H with a little flourish at the top, something he picked up from his father, but this one is just a straight line. Paul leaned forward to look. You're right, that does look different. I'm sure it's just because Dad's hands weren't steady toward the end, Stephanie said quickly. Illness affects motor control. Perhaps, I said. But Harold's hands were steady enough to complete the Morrison house plans just 2 weeks before he died. Beautiful, detailed drawings with that same flourish on every initial. I was making this up, but it sounded plausible, and I could see doubt creeping into Paul's expression. Mom, what are you suggesting? He asked quietly. This was the moment. The choice Harold had written about in his letter. I could continue this gentle probing, hoping Paul would reach the right conclusions on his own. Or I could reveal everything, armed with the evidence to back up my accusations. I thought about Stephanie calling me disposable, about Paul standing by while she planned to warehouse me in assisted living, about the systematic erasure of my contributions to everything Harold and I had built together. I reached for the blue box on the mantel. I'm suggesting, I said, that before we sign any papers or make any final decisions, we should look at some additional documentation I found. Stephanie's face went white. What kind of documentation? Evidence, I said simply, opening the box and removing Harold's letter. Evidence that changes everything. I handed the letter to Paul, watching his face as he read Harold's words. Confusion gave way to shock. Shock to something that might have been shame. Mom, he whispered, is this real? Are you really a 50% partner in Henderson and Associates? Yes. The co-owner of this house? Yes. The person whose consent is required for any major business decisions? Yes. Stephanie was on her feet now, her composed mask finally slipping. That's impossible. Harold never mentioned any partnership. The business was always in his name. Actually, I said, pulling out the incorporation papers, it wasn't. I spread the documents across the coffee table, pushing aside Stephanie's fraudulent transfers and forged signatures. The legal language was clear and unambiguous. Ruth Henderson and Harold Henderson, equal partners in all business ventures, joint owners of all properties acquired during the marriage. This is some kind of mistake, Stephanie said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. These papers are obviously outdated. Things change. Business structures evolve. Not without my signature, I said quietly, and I haven't signed anything changing our partnership status. Which means, I paused, letting the implications sink in. Every decision you've made about the business over the past week has been made without proper authority. Paul was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. But you never, I mean, you always said Dad was the business owner. I said your father ran the business. There's a difference. I pulled out Harold's financial records, the real ones that showed exactly where the missing money had gone. And speaking of differences, here's documentation of where those mysterious transfers actually originated. I watched Stephanie's face as Paul examined the evidence of her thefts. The color drained from her cheeks as he traced the pattern of fraudulent charges, the fake consulting payments, the systematic looting of the company's assets. Stephanie, he said slowly, these payments, they're going to accounts in your name. I can explain that, she said desperately. It's complicated, but there are legitimate reasons. Such as? I asked politely. But Stephanie had no answer. She stood there in my living room, surrounded by evidence of her crimes, finally exposed as the calculating thief she'd always been. Paul looked between his wife and the documents, his world clearly falling apart in real time. How long? He asked quietly. How long has this been going on? 3 years, I said gently. Harold discovered it 6 months ago and hired an investigator. Everything's documented. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock Harold and I had bought for our 10th anniversary. Stephanie stood frozen, apparently unable to speak now that her carefully constructed lies had collapsed. Paul sat heavily in his chair, his head in his hands. God, Mom, what have we done to you? What they'd done was try to erase me, to reduce me to a burden and a problem to be managed. But looking at my son's broken expression, I felt the familiar urge to comfort him, to minimize my own pain to make his easier to bear. Then I remembered Harold's words about taking care of myself first. You tried to make me disappear, I said simply. You tried to steal everything Harold and I built together while painting me as some confused old woman who didn't understand the modern world. I'm sorry, Paul whispered. I'm so sorry, Mom. I should have questioned, should have protected you. Yes, I agreed. You should have, but Stephanie wasn't finished yet. I could see her calculating again, looking for some angle that might salvage her position. Even if those documents are legitimate, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Even if Ruth has some legal claim to the business, the fact remains that she's not capable of running a modern architecture firm. She doesn't understand current technology, contemporary design principles, digital marketing. You're right, I said calmly. I don't understand those things, but I understand something else. I pulled out the last document from Harold's box, the private investigator's final report, complete with photographs and recorded conversations. I understand that you've been planning this takeover for 3 years. I understand that you've been systematically poisoning my son against me while stealing from the company we built, and I understand that you've committed multiple felonies in the process. Stephanie stared at the report, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Now, I continued, you have a choice. You can accept that I'm not the helpless old woman you thought I was. You can acknowledge my partnership in this business, and you can begin making restitution for what you've stolen. Or, I paused, letting the alternative hang in the air. Or I can call the police right now and have you arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and identity theft. The grandfather clock chimed noon, marking the moment when everything changed forever. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Stephanie stood frozen in my living room, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly as she stared at the evidence spread across the coffee table, like accusations written in black and white. Paul broke first. Stephanie, please tell me there's an explanation for this. Please tell me you didn't actually steal from my father's company. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't stealing. It was compensation for work I was already doing. Marketing, client relations, business development. Your father never properly valued my contributions. $200,000 in contributions? I asked mildly. That seems like quite a lot for someone who officially worked part-time and was paid a regular salary. You don't understand the modern business world, Stephanie said, some of her old defiance creeping back. The value I brought to the company, the contacts I developed, the efficiency improvements I implemented, such as firing Mrs. Patterson? I interrupted. Harold's secretary for 18 years. Let go because her salary was bloated? Or dropping the pro bono work for young families because it wasn't profitable enough? Paul was staring at his wife with growing horror. You fired Mrs. Patterson? Mom, you didn't tell me that. There are a lot of things your wife didn't tell you, I said gently. Mrs. Patterson called me yesterday crying. After 18 years of loyal service, Stephanie gave her 20 minutes to clear out her desk. No severance package, no reference letter, just an escort to the door. Stephanie's face flushed. She was resistant to change, set in outdated ways of doing things. Sometimes you have to make difficult personnel decisions for the good of the company. Whose company? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Paul looked between us, understanding dawning in his eyes. It's your company, too, he said slowly. All this time, it's been your company, too. I nodded. Equal partnership. Every major decision, every personnel change, every financial transaction over $50,000 requires both partners' approval. Which means, Paul continued, working through the implications, Stephanie hasn't had the authority to make any of these changes. Correct. The name change to Morrison Design Group, the rebranding, the new client contracts with inflated prices, the personnel decisions. None of it was legally valid without my consent. Stephanie was backing toward the door now, her composure completely shattered. This is ridiculous. You can't just suddenly appear and claim ownership of a business you've never actively participated in running. Never actively participated? I set down the papers and looked at her directly. Stephanie, I kept the books for this company for over 20 years. I handled client communications, coordinated project schedules, managed supplier relationships. I designed the Morrison House, the Riverside Community Center, and 6 other projects that won architectural awards. What exactly do you think active participation means? That was years ago, she said desperately. Things change. You stepped back, became less involved. I stepped back from the day-to-day operations after Paul was born because Harold and I agreed that one of us should focus on raising our son. But I never stepped back from ownership. I never relinquished my legal rights to the company we built together. Paul was reading through more of Harold's documentation, his face growing paler with each page. Mom, there's a letter here addressed to me. From Dad. I hadn't noticed that envelope before, but apparently Harold had left messages for everyone. Paul tore it open with shaking hands. Son, he read aloud, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and your mother has been forced to defend herself against people who should have protected her. I'm sorry you're in this position, but I need you to understand something important. Your mother has been my equal partner in everything we've accomplished, not my assistant or secretary or sidekick. She stepped back to raise you, to give you the stable childhood I never had, but she never stopped being the brilliant woman who helped me build this company from nothing. Paul's voice cracked as he continued reading. I know Stephanie has been working to undermine your mother's confidence, to make her seem like a burden rather than the asset she's always been. I've watched it happen for 3 years, and I'm ashamed that I didn't put a stop to it sooner. But I was hoping Stephanie would grow out of her insecurities, that she would learn to value your mother the way the rest of us do. Stephanie made a sound that might have been a sob or a curse. If you're reading this letter, Paul continued, it means that hope was misplaced. Your wife has chosen greed over family, manipulation over respect. I'm sorry, son, but you need to choose too. You can stand with the woman who gave up her career to raise you and support our family, or you can stand with the woman who's been systematically stealing from that family for years. But you can't do both. Paul set the letter down slowly, his hands shaking. When he looked at Stephanie, there was something in his expression I hadn't seen since he was a child confronting a playground bully. Is it true? He asked quietly. All of it? Stephanie's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. Paul, you have to understand. I was thinking about our future, our children's future. Your mother is old, she won't live forever, and someone needed to secure the family business for the next generation. By stealing from it, by investing in it, by modernizing it, by preparing it for long-term success instead of letting it stagnate under outdated leadership. Outdated leadership. Even now, even caught red-handed, she couldn't resist one more dig at my age and supposed incompetence. The only thing outdated here, I said calmly, is your assumption that you could manipulate and steal from this family without consequences. I gathered the documents into neat stacks, Harold's evidence on one side, Stephanie's forged papers on the other. The contrast was stark, Harold's meticulous record-keeping versus Stephanie's sloppy attempts at covering her tracks. So here's what's going to happen, I continued. First, you're going to return every penny you stole from the company. The consulting fees, the fraudulent expense reports, the personal charges on business accounts, all of it. I don't have that kind of money, Stephanie protested. It's been invested, reinvested, used for legitimate business expenses. Then you'll sell whatever you bought with stolen funds. The jewelry, the designer clothes, the car you bought last year, whatever it takes. Ruth, be reasonable. Even if I liquidated everything, I couldn't possibly repay the full amount immediately. Then we'll set up a payment plan, with interest. Paul was watching this exchange like a tennis match, his head turning back and forth between us. Mom, What about the company? What about the changes Stephanie made? The name reverts to Henderson and Associates, effective immediately. Mrs. Patterson gets her job back with full retroactive pay. The pro bono program resumes. And any clients who were overcharged get refunds. You can't just undo months of business development, Stephanie said, but her voice lacked conviction. Watch me. I pulled out my phone. I still have Mrs. Patterson's number. I'm sure she'll be delighted to return to work for a company that values loyalty and experience. As I dialed, Stephanie sank into Harold's chair, the fight finally going out of her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her armor of false confidence and manufactured authority. Mrs. Patterson? This is Ruth Henderson. I have some wonderful news about your position at the company. The conversation took 15 minutes. So, Patterson cried when I explained what had happened, partly from relief and partly from anger at how she'd been treated, but she agreed to return on Monday morning, ready to help restore the company's values and client relationships. When I hung up, Stephanie was staring at me with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. How long have you been planning this? She asked quietly. I haven't been planning anything, I said truthfully. Until yesterday, I believed everything you told me about being too old, too confused, too irrelevant to matter. Harold spent years trying to build my confidence back up, but you were very good at tearing it down. No, Paul flinched at that assessment, recognizing his own role in my diminishment. But Harold knew this day might come, I continued. He knew that if anything happened to him, you might try to push me aside completely, so he prepared for it. He documented everything, protected me legally, made sure I'd have the resources to fight back if necessary. And if I refuse to cooperate? Stephanie asked. If I decide to contest all this in court? I smiled, feeling Harold's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. Then we'll let the police sort it out. I have enough evidence to send you to prison for embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. Your choice. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows now, casting long shadows across the room where my life had been dismantled and rebuilt in the span of a few hours. The moving boxes sat forgotten in the corner, labeled with destinations I would never reach. Paul stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking. When he turned back to us, his face was streaked with tears. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so ashamed of what I let happen to you. What I helped happen to you. The maternal instinct to comfort him was overwhelming, but I forced myself to remain seated. Harold's letter had been clear about this too. Paul needed to face the consequences of his choices, needed to understand the full weight of what his passivity had cost. I know you are, I said quietly, but sorry doesn't give me back the months of feeling unwanted in my own home. Sorry doesn't restore the confidence you and Stephanie systematically destroyed. Sorry doesn't undo the humiliation of being treated like a burden by my own son. I know, he whispered. I know, and I don't know how to fix it. You can start by making a choice right now, today, in this room. Paul looked between Stephanie and me, understanding that this was indeed a moment of decision that would define the rest of our relationships. I choose you, Mom, he said finally. I choose our family's values over. He gestured helplessly toward Stephanie. Over whatever this has become. Stephanie's face went white. Paul, you can't be serious. I'm your wife. We have children together. We have a life together. We had a life built on stealing from my mother, Paul said, his voice stronger now. We had children who were going to grow up thinking it was normal to discard elderly family members when they became inconvenient. That's not the life I want. So what are you saying? Paul was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden Harold and I had planted together. I'm saying that I need time to figure out how to live with what I've learned about you today, what I've learned about myself. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a passionate declaration. It was quieter than that, sadder. The sound of a marriage dying not with shouting, but with the slow recognition of irreconcilable differences in character. Stephanie gathered her purse and the papers that no longer mattered, moving with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. At the door, she turned back one last time. This isn't over, Ruth. I have rights, too. I have lawyers. Yes, I agreed. You have the right to remain silent when the police arrest you. You have the right to an attorney when you're charged with embezzlement. Beyond that, your rights are somewhat limited. After she left, Paul and I sat in silence for a long time. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful, like it was settling back into its proper shape after months of distortion. What happens now, Mom? Paul asked finally. I looked around at the home Harold and I had built, at the evidence of Stephanie's crimes scattered across our coffee table, at my son who was finally seeing clearly after years of willful blindness. Now, I said, we rebuild the company, our relationship, our family's integrity. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but for the first time in years, I believe it's possible. Outside, the sun was setting over the garden Harold had loved, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. Tomorrow would bring challenges, legal proceedings, business restructuring, the hard work of healing damaged relationships. But tonight, I was Ruth Henderson again. Not Harold's widow, not Paul's burden, not Stephanie's problem to be solved. Just Ruth Henderson, equal partner, homeowner, mother who had finally remembered her own worth. Harold would have been proud. 1 year later, I stood in the conference room of Henderson and Associates, watching Mrs. Patterson train our newest employee, a young woman fresh out of architecture school who reminded me of myself 40 years ago. Eager, talented, and hungry to prove herself in a field still dominated by men. The company had not only recovered from Stephanie's damage, but had grown stronger. Word had spread quietly through the architectural community about our return to core values: fair pricing, community involvement, respect for both innovative design and traditional craftsmanship. Clients who had left during the Morrison Design Group debacle began returning, bringing new referrals with them. Paul knocked on my office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression he'd adopted over the past year, part contrition, part genuine respect, and growing confidence in our rebuilt relationship. "The Henderson Community Center project is ready for your final review," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "The City Council is excited about the design." The Henderson Community Center. Paul had suggested the name, and after some hesitation, I'd agreed. It felt right that Harold's legacy should be honored in a building designed to serve families like ours had once been, before manipulation and greed had nearly torn us apart. "How are Emma and Jack adjusting?" I asked, referring to Paul's children, who now spent every other weekend with me while their parents navigated their separation. "Better than expected. Emma asks about you constantly, and Jack actually said yesterday that he likes visiting Grandma's house because it's peaceful." Peaceful. Such a simple word, but it captured something essential about the life I'd built since reclaiming my place in the world. The house where Stephanie had tried to make me feel like an unwanted guest had become a sanctuary again, filled with the laughter of grandchildren who were learning that family meant support, not disposal. "Any word from Stephanie's lawyer about the final restitution payment?" I asked. Paul's expression darkened slightly. "She's struggling to make the payments. Lost her job at the marketing firm when word got out about the embezzlement charges. She's working retail now, living in a studio apartment across town." I felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that justice was being served. Stephanie had learned what it felt like to have her comfortable life stripped away, to start over with nothing but her own resources. "She asked if she could see the kids," Paul continued quietly. "What did you tell her?" "That supervised visits were possible once she completes her community service and anger management counseling. The children need stability right now, not more manipulation and drama." Paul had grown up significantly over the past year. The passive man who had stood by while his wife dismantled his mother's life had been replaced by someone who made difficult decisions and stood by them. It hadn't been easy for any of us, but especially not for him, facing the dissolution of his marriage and the reality of single parenthood. "I keep thinking about something Dad wrote in that letter," he said, sipping his coffee, "about how you gave up your career to raise me, and how I let Stephanie convince me that sacrifice made you weak instead of strong. You were young when you married her," I said gently. "Young people make mistakes. I was 32, Mom, old enough to know better, old enough to stand up for you." We'd had this conversation many times over the past year, and while I appreciated his remorse, I was more interested in moving forward than dwelling on past hurts. "You're standing up for what's right now," I pointed out. "That's what matters." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face lit with the same warm smile that had greeted clients for 18 years before Stephanie's brief, destructive reign. "Ruth, the Morrison family is here for the final walkthrough of their addition. They specifically requested that you present the finished project." The Morrison family. Harold's last design, completed using his original plans but enhanced with some touches I'd added. A reading nook in the master bedroom. Built-in storage solutions that maximize space without sacrificing beauty. It felt like a collaboration between us, even though he wasn't physically there to see the finished result. As I gathered my presentation materials, I caught sight of myself in the window's reflection. A woman in her 60s wearing a tailored blazer and comfortable shoes, silver hair styled in a way that looked professional without trying to recapture lost youth. I looked like exactly what I was: an experienced architect, a business owner, a grandmother who had survived betrayal and emerged stronger. The walkthrough went beautifully. The Morrisons were thrilled with every detail, particularly the way natural light flowed through the spaces and how the additions seamlessly blended with their home's original character. As we concluded the tour, Mrs. Morrison pulled me aside. "I have to tell you something," she said quietly. "When we first started this project, we were concerned about working with someone your age. We'd heard that older architects sometimes struggle with contemporary needs." I smiled, remembering how Stephanie had used similar language to dismiss my capabilities. "But this design," Mrs. Morrison continued, "it's perfect. It honors the history of our home while giving us exactly what we need for modern family life. You understood our family in a way the younger firms we interviewed never did. Understanding families. Perhaps that was my particular gift, not despite my age, but because of it. I'd lived through enough stages of life to understand how spaces needed to adapt and evolve, how a home should serve the people who lived in it rather than forcing them to conform to arbitrary design principles. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint Harold's roses in shades of pink and gold. The garden had flourished under my renewed attention, and I'd added some new plantings, herbs for cooking, flowers that attracted butterflies, a small vegetable patch that would have made Harold laugh with delight. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Grandma, can I bring my friend Sarah to your house this weekend? I told her about your amazing chocolate chip cookies, and she doesn't believe they're as good as I said." I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. I'll make a double batch." Emma had become my eager assistant in the kitchen, learning the same recipes I'd taught Paul decades ago. But more than that, she was learning something Stephanie had tried to erase from our family's understanding, that older generations had wisdom and skills worth preserving, that being cared for by grandparents was a privilege, not a burden. As darkness settled over the garden, I thought about Harold's final gift to me, not just the financial security or the business partnership documentation, but the reminder of who I'd always been underneath the years of doubt and diminishment. I was Ruth Henderson, architect and businesswoman, mother and grandmother, partner in a marriage that had spanned 4 decades of love and mutual respect. Stephanie's manipulations had convinced me I was disposable, outdated, irrelevant. Harold's evidence had proven otherwise. But more importantly, I had proven it to myself. Not through revenge or public humiliation, but through the quiet reclamation of dignity and purpose. I'd rebuilt my confidence the same way Harold and I had built our business, one careful decision at a time, with patience and integrity, and the kind of strength that comes from knowing your own worth. The house around me settled into its evening rhythms, creaking and sighing like an old friend. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, the ongoing work of healing family relationships and nurturing business growth. But tonight, I was simply Ruth Henderson, sitting in the garden Harold had planted, in the house we'd made beautiful together, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed and a future full of possibility. At 65, I'd discovered something Stephanie had never understood. True power doesn't come from manipulating others or accumulating wealth at any cost. True power comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone convince you otherwise. Harold would have been proud. More importantly, I was proud of myself. And that, I thought as the stars emerged overhead, was the most valuable inheritance of all.